Hi everyone, my name is Luke Menzel, CEO of the Energy Efficiency Council, and welcome to Demand Profile, the EC's new exclusive webinar series for members. At the moment, it's more important than ever that we stay connected as an industry, and at the EEC, we've been working through what we can do to make that happen. We've taken our entire training program online. We've launched a LinkedIn group for EEC members, and if you're not a part of that, I encourage you to jump on board. Next week, we're launching a new podcast, First Fuel, to kick along the big national conversation around energy efficiency. And today we're launching this new exclusive webinar series for members only. So Demand Profile will be short, informal chats with an expert in policy technology that will help you stay at the cutting edge of the market, otherwise known as an opportunity for me to wonk out with an expert from the industry. And I can't think of a better expert to wonk out with than Carlos Flores, Director of the National Australian Built Environment Rating System, more commonly known as NABERS. Welcome, Carlos.
Thanks, Luke. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's my absolute pleasure. So there's a bit of a pun in the name Demand Profile. Obviously, we're interested in the energy efficiency, energy management, demand response, and Demand Profile is a big part of that. But we're also interested in getting to know leaders within our sector, and I think, Carlos, we can say that that you're one of those leaders. The one things that I once wondered, you've told me this story, but I'm not sure everyone has, is that you don't hail from Australia originally. You've made your way here and you've climbed the greasy pole of energy efficiency policy and programs to pretty much the very top of the tree. What's your journey? How did you end up in the position you're in working here in Australia?
I think it's an interesting question. And a lot of people know me. I was born and raised in Chile. If you haven't met me, my name is a bit of a giveaway, and so is my accent. But and I came about 10 years ago. Like a lot of people, I've actually met a lot of people in this sector that came to Australia for maybe a year, maybe two, and then you suddenly, fall in love with the country, nature, how relaxed people are. I always joke with my friends that are coming from overseas about how the two ministers that I report to go by Matt and Rob, that the Treasury goes by Josh, that the Victorian Environment Minister goes by Billy. That's a part of Australian culture that is just really really interesting, that the status is not as big as it exists in other countries, and people are a lot more closely related than you see in other places. And I came to energy efficiency almost by accident. So I'm a mechanical engineer. A lot of my work early on was in renewables. And I came into building sustainability when I was looking for, roles in this space about 10 years ago. And I think it's a part of the reason why I'm still in this space is because Australia happened to be not at the beginning, but still in the early days of a real revolution in building sustainability and energy efficiency back in 2009. There's a lot of things happening. Things were starting to scale up across the whole market. And I just happened to land in a market where, as you well know, Luke, where there are things happening in Australia at scale that are happening in very little places in the world, if any. So it's a real privilege to be able to work with so many market leaders, people doing just really amazing work. So I feel really lucky to have landed in that space, and I think there's just so much more to do in the next decade.
Well, it's something that we often comment on, that there are a lot of areas of energy efficiency where we feel like we're lagging behind some of the leaders in the world, but commercial buildings isn't really one of them, and NABERS, and obviously the Commercial Building Disclosure Program has played a huge part in that. And it just occurs to me, Carlos, that something that folk that have dialed in today may not be aware of is the international engagement that NABERS is having, and the kind of attention you're getting from places like the UK around what we've been able to achieve in Australia around building disclosure using NABERS, and what the opportunities might be to pick up the Australian system.
Absolutely. I think we, as a program, we do a lot of work with a lot of people from a lot of countries. We do quite a bit of engagement, and often people are just really surprised by the fact that A, we have a lot of data in Australia. A lot of countries just don't have a lot of data. And B, that there are some markets like offices in energy efficiency, but also markets like shopping centers, where we're seeing just really deep, sustained reductions in energy use across whole markets that just pretty much don't exist in any other country. A lot of people don't know that in the last decade, Australia reduced in the office market energy use by somewhere around 30% in one decade, which is almost unheard of. And a lot of people just really, when I show that data internationally, well, people just are really surprised that we have the data, and B, that buildings are reducing like that. In a lot of countries, those markets it's not like no one's doing energy efficiency, but what you're definitely not doing is seeing an average improvement of 30%. It's just very far from that.
Mm-hmm. So I've got some questions for you. We're going to get into it because we're trying to keep these sessions short, sharp, and to the point. We've got 45 minutes. But I also wanted to alert everybody in the webinar that there is a Q&A function. So you can click on the button down the bottom of your screen labeled Creatively Q&A and submit your questions. I don't guarantee I'm going to ask all of your questions, but it's absolutely worth a shot. And I'll certainly try and keep an eye on the Q&A screen that I've got up in front of me here, and weave some of your questions into the conversation with Carlos as we go along. Now, unsurprisingly, there is a topic at the moment, the one thing that everyone can't avoid and can't stop talking about, which is, of course, COVID-19. And it's having a range of really complex impacts across the economy and even across the energy efficiency sector. It's playing out in really different ways in different parts of the sector. I've got some specific questions, Carlos, but I might start off by just, as someone who's talking to a lot of people across the industry all the time, what is your sense of how it's playing out in the commercial building market as it relates to energy efficiency? What are some of the trends that you're seeing emerging?
We're seeing a lot of trends. I think I'd like to start by saying that, I just want to acknowledge it's a really difficult time for a lot of people. This is a huge health crisis. I was born and raised overseas, and I have family in several countries, and there's a lot of people who are doing really tough right now. In Australia, we've actually been very fortunate to be in a position where very few countries are right now of seeing a lot of cases going down. And beyond that, there's also the obviously huge economic impact of what's happening in terms of the side effects, some of the policies that we have to take to keep the human cost down. And I think one of the things that we've been really fortunate is, as a program, we just do a lot of work with a lot of people and work very closely with a lot of people in industry. And because of that, we started to get feedback about the possible consequences of this really early on. And what I mean by that is we had feedback and emails from assessors and property companies as early as maybe the last week of February, saying, hey, have you thought about these consequences? Because if this keeps going, this could happen, this could happen. And so I think within a week or two, and look, actually, people in this webinar may not know, you actually sit in our board, in the NABERS board, in the NABERS steering committee. And we had a lot of people, including the Energy Efficiency Council, reaching out and saying that we had to do something, and we had to take this seriously. Within the first couple of weeks in March, we actually put aside a lot of projects that we were running for the next few months to create a dedicated task force of several people in NABERS working full time on this. And it's mostly because we had so much feedback, way earlier than we would have if we didn't have this kind of connections. And it's for that reason, we actually were able to start putting responses to some of these issues. We actually were the first rating tool in Australia to put concrete responses and changes and amendments to respond to the reality we were seeing on the ground weeks before pretty much anyone else. And we actually got quite a few rating tools from overseas asking us what we were doing, because that feedback actually allowed us to move weeks before what we would have done otherwise. And so I think I think there's a lot that we still have to do, but we've started to get feedback on, what does this mean for energy efficiency companies? We heard a lot of companies saying that this is really affecting demand for all their services, including NABERS rating, but also monitoring, capital investment. A lot of projects that they were hoping that they were going to happen in a few months have been put on hold. So there's a lot of that happening right now. And on the building owner side, there's also a lot of people reaching out to say that things are really tight because they have tenants that rent space, and a lot of them are unable to pay the rent right now, or they're asking for discounts, or simply they are just canceling contracts. If you're in an office like a co-sharing space where you're paying month by month, you can actually pull that contract out and just leave those buildings. So there's a lot of flow-on effects that are reaching a lot of sectors. There are sectors that have been actually much more affected, even like hotels, where there's basically hardly anyone in them right now, no income. So we're very conscious that this is a real deep economic impact. And if I can add one more thing about this, look, we had a lot of people also that told us that we actually had a real meaningful role to play, and that really changed the way we thought about this internally. They basically said, look, NABERS represents somewhere between $10 and $50 million or business for energy efficiency and service facility manager companies over the next 12 months. But it's not just the ratings themselves, actually much bigger than that. It's also all the monitoring services and advice and capital investments and buildings trying to reach the next star rating. If we actually didn't do anything to allow ratings to keep moving, it would have actually been a huge, an additional blow to an industry that is already facing a lot of consequences. So I think we're doing, from that point, I think this was in mid-March, just before our steering committee, we talked about this extensively with you in other big industry bodies and governments, that our number one priority right now is do everything we can to keep NABERS ratings running, because we know what they mean in terms of keeping a lot of these businesses running. It's hundreds of jobs that are an ecosystem that is kind of built around NABERS. And secondly, do everything we can to keep encouraging people to reduce energy. There are a lot of things that buildings can do right now, and really encourage those buildings to do those. And so I think we're still in the middle of that, but we'll definitely do everything we can to try to achieve those two goals.
Yeah, and look, it's congratulations to you and the entire team, Carlos, because you're right. I think that one of the benefits of the NABERS National Steering Committee, on which I sit with a whole bunch of other people, is that you do have a fairly clear and robust feedback on market conditions and what we're hearing from all of our members on a very regular basis. And you're very good at picking up the phone when I call, so thank you for that. But it's one thing to hear the information, and it's another thing to act on it and act as quickly as you did. And I think it's a testament to NABERS culture that a government-run program like this was able to pivot so quickly and get those time-bound rulings out as quickly as you did. So it's a perfect segue, Carlos, into those rulings. And I thought there's kind of stuff that's already out in the market and stuff that you're consulting on at the moment that you're keen to cover. But maybe if we start with the time-bound rulings and what you've done immediately to make it more straightforward for NABERS assessments to take place in the current environment.
Yeah, so we've actually done 2 rounds of ruling, or perhaps an easier way to put it is we put one ruling and then we've done an update a couple of weeks later. And really we focused early on just the most pressing urgent issues that people were raising. So if you go back to early March, you'll remember that there's still people working on a lot of offices. Not all offices were vacated, but assessors were starting to have issues going into some sites, and maybe some buildings didn't want them to go on site. But also we certify a lot of buildings in just more smaller towns, in regional areas across all states. And a lot of those assessors actually travel from, Sydney to, Dubbo, yeah, right? And a lot of that travel was being discouraged, by the authorities, but also by the assessor companies themselves. A lot of them had internal bans on traveling. So early on, we just went, well, we have to do something about access and site visits, and we started to provide a lot of flexibility on a temporary basis. So we said for the next few weeks or for the next couple of months, if you've done a site visit on that building before, a lot of assessors do ratings over 2 or 3 years in a row. If you've done that site visit before and you had documentation, maybe we ask you to just find additional confirmation that some important things have not changed since. We're also allowing some assessors, if you're not able to access a site, that somebody goes and takes photographic evidence for you, maybe even do a video and do like an assisted kind of site visit together, more like a virtual site visit. So we started to provide a lot of flexibility on those urgent issues that were stopping ratings right there and then. And we released a ruling, I believe, towards like the last week of March. And it's really interesting what's happened, because we've had about 3 or 4 weeks of data by now, and we had a lot of sites using them. I think the latest count is that 70 buildings have used the rulings, and we had 20 or 30 that just requested to use it as well. So that is more than 50%, possibly more than 2/3 of all the ratings that we certified recently. So if we would have not implemented these measures, it would have been really hard for a lot of those ratings. They just wouldn't have happened. Now, initially, that was our response. Let's focus on the immediate urgent issues that were happening right there and then. I think we've addressed a lot of those, and we're still working on a lot of areas, but now we're working on things that are more niche, affecting less buildings, affecting, how do you do measurements on indoor environment quality when there's no one in the building. So we're going into, from all the ratings being affected, more towards targeted areas that we're refining at the moment. And I think that's where we're at. I think we still we have an ongoing process, by the way. So if there's anyone in this call who's got an issue that you think that we haven't addressed, we would love to hear your feedback. We actually have a dedicated page on our website. You will see it on the front page right away, where we're collecting feedback ongoing. If you have any questions, please reach out to us. But that was our regional immediate response, urgent issues. And we're providing flexibility that doesn't necessarily last forever, but that we can extend for as long as we have to. So we have to extend it for 4 months. We will do that. If it has to be longer than that, we'll do that too.
And I know you're talking to NABERS assessors all the time. What's the feedback been now that they've had the opportunity to test out some of those arrangements that you've put in place?
Oh, I think most of them are really thankful for this. And by the way, there's hardly anything in those rulings that is actually our ideas. We had a lot of assessors coming in. Most of the things in those rulings are the assessors' ideas explained in detail and with a lot of testing from them as well. So I'm sure that a lot of them would like us to go further and address more issues, and we definitely want to do that, and we are working to do that. But I think they're very thankful that we're trying as much as we can to allow ratings to go through, do everything we can for work to continue. We've also done a couple more things that are on a case-by-case basis as well to assist assessors that have some cash flow issues and would like longer invoices. There's a few things that we're trying to do to help these assessor companies as much as we can. I think one more thing we did recently is that we provided a 50% discount on the fees that assessors pay on an annual basis. And obviously we don't want to stop there. So we're doing a lot of work in the background to see what other areas beyond the NABERS rule and beyond ratings as a program we could do to help the sector. So if anyone has any ideas of any kind, we're actually really open to them. We don't always have the ability to act on all of those ideas, but we do work with a lot of people in government and in the private sector. So any idea is a good idea right now, and we'd love to hear it.
So I think that's an open invitation for you all to email Carlos directly all of your ideas for how to respond to the COVID-19
I should have said
crisis.
The best point of contact would probably be nabers@environment.nsw.gov.au. Okay. And also our website where we have an ongoing consultation process going.
All right. Look, I haven't seen any questions on those specific rulings, but if there are any questions on the detail of those rulings, Carlos, I think we might circle back to them. I'm not sure if Andy on my team has dropped it into the chat, but we do have a link to the landing page you've got with all the COVID-19 stuff. So for those, we'll drop that in the chat as well if we haven't already done so. And if there's people that haven't had a chance to catch up with those, there's a lot of detail there, and I think you've done a great job, Carlos, not just in saying what the ruling is, but stepping through your thinking for why you've arrived at the changes that you have. It's incredibly clear. So well done on that. So that was the stuff that you got out the door very, very quickly. But I think based on our recent conversations, it became pretty clear pretty quickly that there were some pretty significant medium and long-term issues that you would need to address, and you're sort of midstream on working your way through those. So do you want to take us through the consultation paper you released last week?
Absolutely. So the paper is actually open for consultation between now and the 1st of May, but possibly is actually going to go beyond that. So we have to have a deadline somewhere, but I'm going to run you through some of the things in the paper, but some of them, their nature means that we'll have to work with a lot of people and probably on a more targeted basis after that. Because we actually need a lot of data to explore some of these options further. So there's about 5 or 6 proposals on the paper, but really the first 2 are the main reason why we wanted to do a proper consultation process and get a lot of ideas. I think the main thing we're trying to tackle is what are going to be the longer term effects on NABERS ratings, on the actual rating results. And a lot of these actually coming from the fact that we are seeing, we're getting anecdotal evidence from assessors on a couple of things. First is that if buildings are relatively unoccupied, we are seeing energy consumption going down in a lot of these sites. And this is not just about offices, it's also shopping centers and hotels and most buildings out there that have a low amount of occupancy. So there is, and I say it's anecdotal evidence because we don't have as a program a lot of this data, but we have lots of people telling us about energy consumption going down in a lot of assets. So that's one. Energy is arguably going down in a lot of places. But the second one is that NABERS actually wasn't designed for a pandemic. So we have rules that deal with occupancy and is this tenancy considered occupied or not? We have rules for that. But those rules weren't designed for having thousands of buildings with very few or possibly no people in those tenancies, and possibly receiving air conditioning and services or not. So that's not a case that we covered. So the practical outcome of that is that there's actually quite a few opinions out there of, how do we treat these spaces? Are these spaces empty or are they occupied? And I would argue that the NABERS rules are a little bit unclear on that, and there's a few interpretations. So I think in any case, we probably need to do something to clarify that. But I think the main question really is about what are we going to do to those rating results? If the rating results go up, is that okay? Or do we want to do something to allow that, to make sure that ratings are more comparable over years? And by this point, because we've, a few days into the consultation process, we actually had a lot of different opinions on this. So we know that these proposals are going to be, are going to require quite a bit of thinking, quite a bit of data, and quite a bit of feedback. But I wanted to point you to maybe two proposals that are really the core proposals we want a lot of feedback on. And I want to start with proposal number 2 in that paper, because it's actually easier to explain and less controversial. Proposal number 2 is basically a stopgap that is basically designed to give us a little bit more time to think. So what it is a temporary moratorium on using energy, water, and consumption data in general for March, April, right now, and May. So it is it's basically something that so just to explain in simple terms, if you're doing a NABERS rating, you need 12 months of energy data and water data. What this would do is basically force the 12 months of data to temporarily end at on the 28th of February, no later than that. For the next couple of months. And that's actually the case for most ratings that are coming in right now anyway. If you're certifying a building on the 24th of April, you're not using data from the 23rd of April. You're often using data that are at least 1 month old, sometimes 2, sometimes even 4 months old. So, but it is basically making sure that for the time being, while we're thinking about what to do, no one gets an unfair advantage or disadvantage because of what's happening. And so that's basically is a stopgap, and it's temporary. So we wouldn't keep this for the next 12 months. We're planning to keep this for the next maybe 2 months, just to give us enough time to think about proposal number 1. And proposal number 1 is really the center of the consultation, and it's a much more difficult issue and topic to address than proposal number 2. And that is, do we do an adjustment to NABERS ratings to account for the fact that they're largely unoccupied or very low occupancy, and that they're using less energy? We actually have, one proposal in the paper with a couple of options underneath, but I thought, look, I'm not sure if you think this is the best way of doing it, but I thought maybe we could break it down into the 3 main type of proposals that people have, suggested today. Do you think that's a good way to do it?
That sounds good. So
the first one is that we had people saying, you could actually do no adjustment. So it's basically saying that we will do just some clarifications to make sure that the NABERS rules are clear, but for the most part, possibly allowing buildings to, if energy is going down, just allowing buildings to reflect that in their ratings. And it's very possible a lot of buildings will go up in ratings. And by the way, I'm explaining these 3 proposals, and we don't really have a favorite proposal right now. We actually very genuinely want your feedback on this. Now, what is the advantage of doing no adjustments? One of them is really practical and really simple to do. So it's actually relatively straightforward to do. A lot of people said, everyone knows that COVID-19 2020 is going to be an unusual year for many, many aspects of the buildings and businesses that we work with. So most people will explain why that happened and why a lot of ratings will probably go down after a year later when activities go back to normal. So that is another advantage of an approach like this, is that we're actually using energy and data from March and April and May. So we're still encouraging and rewarding people to reduce energy. And if you can do more and, maybe close a lot of floors that you're not using, and maybe if you have only 3 or 4 people in a building, maybe they can just go into 2 floors instead of having 10 floors running. So there are things that a lot of buildings could do, and this still encourages them and rewards them for using less energy in those months. Now, One disadvantage that a lot of people have raised as well is that it means that a lot of people, their ratings are going to go up, but it's not necessarily because the buildings are a lot more efficient than they were in previous years. And it's also the rating is a bit less comparable.
Yep.
So that's one proposal, no adjustment. Now, there's a second proposal, which is the opposite of that, which is let's find some kind of adjustment to account for the fact that energy is going down, and it will go down, across the board on average by some percentage. We could do this in a lot of ways, but maybe just to give you an example of how this could work, if we see that energy is going down by 20%, let's say on average in offices in March, April, and May, we could just find an adjusting factor that means that no one gets a better or worse rating if you're going down by 20%. So your rating stays the same if you go down, to that mark. If you're reducing energy more than 20%, then maybe your rating starts getting better. And if you reduce not as much and you drop your energy consumption by worse than the average, then your rating gets worse. So that could be one way to implement that. Again, there's pros and cons with this. One of them is that maybe the ratings will be more comparable from year to year, and no one gets a free kick just because the buildings aren't occupied. That's one way of looking at it. Another one is that it also uses data from March and April. So it actually encourages people to, again, use less energy during those months. So it's not, it's actually encouraging the right thing. Obviously, the main disadvantage with this proposal, and we've had quite a few people coming with this feedback, is that it's actually not easy to do at all. It's not doing an adjustment of this nature is not straightforward because occupancy is difficult to measure. A lot of people don't know how occupied these buildings are. So actually coming up, and we currently don't have the data to do this just yet. And to be honest, we actually don't know if an adjustment of this nature can be done well because we don't have the data to be able to do it just now. So, but what we do know is that if we had the data, we will be able to assess, is this actually a possible option? Can we do this well or not? So one of the things that I'm probably going to mention before the end of this webinar is that we are looking for data. We don't want just feedback. We also want to know, is this an option that could be done? Because if it isn't, then obviously we won't do it. But if it is possible, it's good to know that is technically possible or not. So that's adjusting, for those months is another option. And I think that the final option is basically that we don't use data from this period at all. And what I mean by this is that some people came forward and suggested that, well, why don't we just find a way to completely exclude data taken from March, April, May, however long buildings are running on an occupied basis. And there's a couple of ways of doing it. One of them is that, for example, we could, in a 12 months rating period of data, maybe month April and May, some people say, well, why don't you use last year's consumption for those months? And that way you have a 12-month period that is relatively representative. That's one option. Other people said, well, maybe you could just use 9 months of data, and we can just declare, the building unoccupied for the next 3 months. So there's a few ways that you could do it. And it's got, one really strong advantage, which is that it's relatively easy to do as well. So that's one, but it's got a couple of disadvantages that are I think quite significant. One of them is that it doesn't use data from March, April, and May. So what it means in practice is that we will not be encouraging or rewarding people for reducing energy doing more during this time. So I think that's one that several people raised already. And the second one is that these kind of solutions can possibly work if the lockdown periods are short. So if we're talking about, maybe another month, and then a lot of people would start to return to work, maybe some of these things could work. But if we're talking about, we actually don't know how long a lot of these buildings are going to be unoccupied at this point. And the situation keeps going for longer, these options become a lot harder because suddenly the amount of data that you're using for this year becomes smaller and smaller the longer this goes on. So every option of these three options, not doing no adjustments, doing some adjustments to the ratings, or just finding a way not to use the data for the period, all of them have pros and cons. And at this point, we're actually really interested in, we want to hear what you think. We actually want feedback and your ideas on these topics. And the second thing that we want is we actually want people who have access to data, we would like to get more data to be able to assess what's going to be the impact, whether the adjustment option is an option or not. And that's much of the work that we're planning to do from the 1st of May. So I think did that make some sense, Luke?
Yeah, totally. And it was really useful for me to hear again from you what the various options are. And it's just thrown me back into the conversation we were having several days ago around the implications of those different options, and thinking through particularly the last one of just ignoring the data, and that point that you raise around us just not knowing how long this goes on for. And I guess the other piece of that is that even if the lockdowns end, that doesn't mean that everybody suddenly returns to work. There's going to be an element here of sort of governments making decisions at a high level about, you know, who can do what. And then at the next level down from that, you've got organisations and corporates will be, I think, quite cautious about sending their team back to work, especially when everyone's set up to work from home. And then you've got individual decision making as well. And while there'll be some people that are champing at the bit to get out of their bedrooms, I'm sure there will be others that want to take a pretty cautious approach over coming months, given their particular circumstances. Which is to say that while, you know, post-lockdown, you might see some reoccupancy, it doesn't mean that it's going to go back to exactly the way it was very, very quickly. And so that means there could be quite a long tail to the occupancy implications of this crisis.
Exactly. And I think it really is a little bit too early to tell. I think we are privileged that the fact that the cases are going down, that there is some prospect that some of these buildings could open up or the occupancy could grow in the next few months, but it really is too early to know. And it's one of the reasons, look, why we're actually really interested in this, what we really like this proposal number 2, which is just giving us a bit of a stopgap for maybe a month or another month, collect data, get a lot of feedback, and making a long-term decision with more data, not just on can we do adjustments of which of these 3 options is the better option to go with, but also we're going to have more data on what are the prospects that some of these buildings might open up. And I think that all of those things are important to make a good long-term decision. And that proposal number 2 gives us the time to do it. And it also means everyone gets an NABERS rating based on a meaningful amount of 12 months data that is directly comparable. So it doesn't really negatively affect a lot of people. Yeah, it's interesting times. I think we have a lot of work ahead of us, but I'm actually really proud of our team in particular, because they're doing a lot of work on tackling something that is very difficult, that we're not planning to work on this a few months ago. And also we've been just really fortunate. We got a ton of feedback already, even though this just opened a few days ago. We already had a lot of really interesting nuanced feedback from a lot of perspectives, and we really want a lot more before this consultation process closes.
And going to those questions and the feedback you're seeking, I've got a question here in our Q&A tab, and I remind everybody on the webinar that if you've got a question for Carlos, you can click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and pose it to us. Someone named Holly Taylor. I'm not sure who she works for, but Holly asks Carlos, how is NABERS planning to acquire statistically significant data to demonstrate a 20% or whatever drop in offices over the 3-month period? I guess the question is there, well, you know, how much data do you need to be able to make that sort of determination? Yeah,
I think it's a really good question. And it's a difficult question to answer, not because, mostly because it's not just about a number. Like often in a population of shopping centers, there's only like 400 to 500 shopping centers in Australia that are big enough for us to certify historically. So we're not talking about we don't need hundreds of buildings. And even the office market, we certify most office buildings out there, and it's still about 1,500 a year, right? So in a universe like that, data from maybe 100 buildings might be enough, but it's not actually about the number. It's about how representative that number is. And we're fortunate on the one hand that there are a lot of the really big companies with big sustainability teams. We have a really close relationship with them, and we might be able to get a lot of data from that group, maybe even more than 100 buildings, right? But the challenge is that they're not necessarily representative of the whole market. A lot of them have net zero targets by 2030, and obviously that's not the reality across the whole market. So I think a possible idea that we've been brainstorming internally is that a lot of energy efficiency companies that work with those companies also work with other companies. So I think the energy efficiency sector actually reaches out to a lot of the users that are in, B grade buildings, C grade buildings, even A grade buildings. Not all of them are owned by a lot of those big assets. So I think that's a group that we're particularly interested in. A lot of people in this webinar would fit that definition. And I think there's a third avenue which we've been exploring in the office, which is if we implement this proposal too, we'll start getting ratings with data from up until the end of February. But we could ask those assessors to also give us the later bills. You can still include them in the rating. They're just not going to change their result. But if they're doing the rating already, they might actually have access to March and April. So we could collect data through that. And that could give us a really good complement. It's a slow process though, because we only get data as ratings are coming through. But it is a process to complement the data we might be able to get from some of these larger portfolios.
Okay, no, that sounds fantastic. So, Carlos, what are you looking for from the industry? You said you've got a consultation paper out. I should probably note that the Energy Efficiency Council's Commercial Buildings Task Group is going to be meeting next week to discuss this issue, and the EEC itself will be putting in a submission. So, anyone that is on this webinar that is interested in getting involved in that process and isn't already a member of the Commercial Buildings Task Group, please let us know, and we'll make sure you're included on that call. If you are a member of the task group, you'll be getting a notification of that meeting time early next week. But if individuals have data they wish to submit or views they want to put on their own behalf, what do they do? How do they get in touch?
Yes, I think we're looking for maybe three things, Luke. The first one is for submissions. We want to hear your thoughts on some of these questions we have on this consultation paper. The second one is that we really need data. And when I mean data, especially for this group, what we mean is energy data from the 1st of March onwards. And if anyone has any estimate for occupancy, some buildings have ways to get that, others don't. If you don't have that, the energy data is still really helpful. But if you do have that, the combination of energy and occupancy is really powerful, because one way we could introduce an adjustment if we we're going to go down that path, it's not just like doing a really blunt instrument of everyone goes down by 20%. We might be able to introduce an occupancy kind of adjustment. We could be much more gradual. So if buildings are coming back gradually and becoming more occupied, maybe that's the path that we could take. So occupancy is something that we're really interested in. So those two things. And look, one way that we are using these consultation processes in general is that we get a lot of the feedback, we consider all the opinions, but also it really helps us to identify people who have a lot of expertise or insights on some specific areas. And we often do a lot of targeted, consultation after the closure of this period to test a lot of these ideas and explore those ideas further. And we don't, we know a lot of people in industry, but we don't know everybody. There's a lot of people that do a lot of work. Maybe they don't do NABERS ratings directly, but have a lot of insights. And these kind of processes can really help us identify people who are a little bit further removed from NABERS itself, but do a lot of work in energy efficiency and have a lot of good ideas.
Well, that's a call to action for everybody on this call. Carlos relies on his eyes and ears out on the ground and in the market, and certainly we at the Energy Efficiency Council do everything we can to collate your views and express a view on behalf of the industry. But I think that anecdotal evidence, you don't make a rule change based on a single view, but when you hear the same thing from 10 different people that have credibility and standing in the market, then that I know, Carlos, is incredibly valuable for you. So encourage everybody to support NABERS through this period so that we can land in the right place as an industry. And I think that's the shared mission that we all have, those of us that are passionate about energy efficiency and energy management in the commercial building space. Carlos, I suppose one of the things I've been reflecting on, and maybe we can close out on this, is the longer term implications of COVID-19 for different parts of the economy and how it's going to change the way we work, the way that different industries function. We've touched on it a little bit already, how quickly are people going to be returning to their office buildings? But I suppose there's an even bigger question than that, is, are they going to return to their office buildings? Something that I know Rob Murray-Leach, our head of policy, has been talking about for years is the rise of telecommuting, the decentralisation of cities away from the CBDs. Technology enables people to do their job, many people to do their job from literally their bedrooms or their home offices or whatever it is. And we've just given the entire economy a crash course in how that can be done and how achievable it is. And if people are managing now with the kids at home, it's going to seem like a dream when the kids go back to school. So what are your thoughts from the lofty position of the NABERS administrator, sort of talking to different people and being intimately involved with the market, about how things might emerge? I know I'm asking you to sort of do a bit of future casting here, and I won't hold you to any of this, although I will play this back to you in 5 years. What do you think?
So I think, look, the fact that so that conversation that you've been having with Rob Murray-Leach, I think a lot of people have been having the same conversation. Yeah. No, I have a lot of people that I know have been having that, and I do think that these are unprecedented times. We've been doing things that we didn't think that were going to happen for a long time. And I think one of the possible changes out of this is that, we're making some progress on the way we all work digitally and interact, digitally with society. Also, it also talks about the way we buy things, and that it's very possible that things like telecommuting are going to move more in the next, few months after we come back than they have maybe in a decade. It's just been the amount of telecommuting that's happened in the last couple of months is unprecedented. So I think we have been hearing a lot of feedback from people who work for building owners as well. So not just people who, like you and me, who see some of these things from the perspective of an occupant, but also people who rent space. And it is a conversation in their companies as well. I just can't tell you that I know what the consequences are going to be. I don't think anyone knows. It is possible that I don't think a lot of companies are necessarily going to go fully online and no one's going to have an office anymore. But if the number of people that a lot of companies feel a lot more comfortable about people working a day or two from home, some of the impacts in the longer term might be that the amount of office space they rent in the future might be smaller next time they rent leases. Those are consequences. I think we've seen a glimmer of that on the move to activity-based working. People used to rent bigger offices than before, and then they move into flexible working, which means that you can maybe rent 10 or 20%, a smaller office than before. We might actually see an impact like that. But in saying that, what we saw with what happened with activity-based working is that we're actually seeing the office sector in particular really respond to that and adapt to that. And so I have no doubt that that's exactly what's going to happen in this case. The question is whether it's going to happen really fast or is it going to be more gradual. My prediction is that it's going to be perhaps faster than the activity-based working movement. But possibly it's going to be there's an aspect of it that might force it to be a little bit more gradual than some people might think, because there's a lot of ongoing leases. I work for a government agency that signed a new lease for, I believe, something like 15 years, and it just started a few months ago. I don't know what capacity. I don't think a lot of those contracts are necessarily going to change immediately, if at all. So a lot of companies will be in those kind of positions. So that might mean that we're not going to see necessarily an abrupt change for everyone in the market at once in a few months. I think it might be more gradual than that.
Well, we will check back in 5 years and see how well you've done.
I thought you were going to use the last minute look to tell me what your forecast is going to be.
Sure. So I do kind of think that there's going to be a pretty significant shift in the way that we work after this. I agree. It's very hard to say how rapidly that will take place, but I'm kind of watching for the shift to spaces that have flexible meeting rooms. And because I think that while people are quite comfortable working from home, we're going to want to get back together and get into rooms with people. And often we use our offices for that. You can use a coffee shop to an extent, but there's a limit to how practical that is with larger groups. And so spaces that offer flexible meeting rooms, a little bit of hot desking. I know in our organisation that's something that we're actively contemplating when we get out of our home offices, and so that's something that I'll be watching, Carlos. But I'm watching the time. It's 2:45. I committed to 45 sharp minutes, so I want to thank you, Carlos Flores, Director of NABERS, for being so candid, for being so open. You're always keen to hear from industry. I think anyone that hasn't heard Carlos speak before, I think it will have come across in the course of this call how committed Carlos is to being guided by the industry, and that's one of the reasons why NABERS is as successful as it is, because it is a collaboration between industry, government and commercial building owners, and it's an incredibly successful one, and one that is being looked to around the world. And so congratulations for that, Carlos, and carrying that torch forward. For everyone on the webinar, I just want to let you know that for future editions of Demand Profile, keep an eye on your emails from the Energy Efficiency Council. I understand that Andy has put a link in the chat for our next edition, which will be with Tennant Reid, who's the head of Energy Emissions and Environment at the Australian Industry Group. We're going to be having a similar conversation with Tennant in a couple of weeks' time, sort of reflecting on the implications of COVID-19 for the industrial sector and what that means for energy and carbon management. I'd also point you to our new podcast, Demand Profile, which is launching in the next week or so, but we're broadcasting every recording of that podcast as a webinar, kicking off with Anna Scarbeck next Thursday, and the week after that we're going to be catching up with Brian Motherway from the International Energy Agency, and both Anna and Brian have been out there advocating for the role of energy efficiency as part of stimulus packages that are being put together by governments here in Australia and around the world. So really timely conversations with both of them. So plenty of the opportunities to tickle the brain cells and connect with the conversations that we're having here at the Energy Efficiency Council over the coming weeks. So thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your questions. Thank you, Carlos, and we look forward to catching you all again soon.
Thank you all.